Everything you need to know about To Kill a Mockingbird, Chapter 28. So now that we're through Chapter 28, let's go through it. I'll tell you this is a crucial chapter to read as it's pretty important to the plot, and the details are key to kind of figuring out what happens. A summary is not going to do it justice, but it's still useful. This chapter is long, and so the summary is a little longer as well. Scout starts the chapter with a weather report of sorts. It's warm for Halloween, they have no need for jackets, it's a little windy out, and it might rain. There was no moon on this night. They walk by the Radley place on the way to the pageant, and of course it looks creepy. Jem is carrying Scout's ham costume for her. They kind of laughed about their childhood superstitions, but Scout is glad that Jem is with her just the same as they pass by the Radley place. It shows they're kind of growing up and looking back, and they're more mature. Going around the corner, Scout trips on a root in the road, and Jem drops the costume trying to help. When they enter the schoolyard for the walk across it to get to the actual gym, it's pitch black out. All right, but Jem can tell when they're under the big oak tree because the ground there is cooler. In the distance, they can see the bright lights of the high school auditorium. Scout tells Jem he should have brought a flashlight, and when he's answering her that he didn't know it would be this dark, somebody leaps out at them. Jem screams in fright, and Cecil Jacobs, laughing, flicks on his flashlight. Cecil asks why they're alone and aren't they afraid of Boo Radley, but Jem says it's just around the corner and shouldn't be a big deal for them to be able to walk there. Scout admits Cecil's scare was good. Cecil is playing a cow in the pageant, so he tells Scout to put her costume behind the stage with his, and then they can go off to the carnival. Jem likes the idea of Scout going off with Cecil so he can be with his friends. Scout thinks she forgot her money, but Jem hands her 30 cents from Atticus to do 6 things at the carnival, and she and Cecil go off in one direction and Jem in the other. Scout tells us about going to a haunted room, visiting a couple of boos, buying some junk food, but before they could buy taffy, they're sent for to come and get ready for the pageant. Backstage, someone had squished her costume, but Miss Merriweather comes over and reshapes it for her. The next half a page highlights Miss Merriweather's speech about the history of Maycomb, and Scout tells us that Miss Merriweather talked for over half an hour about Colonel Maycomb, who the county was named after. It was during this speech that Scout fell asleep and missed her cue to walk across stage. She does stumble out during the finale when the band is playing, but it's a little too late at that point. Everyone cracks up. At the end, everyone's cheering for the pageant, but Miss Merriweather chews Scout out backstage for ruining her pageant. Jem came to get her and showed her some sympathy, telling her she did all right even if she came out late. Scout's too embarrassed to leave straight away, so they wait backstage until the audience is gone. Scout decides to keep her costume on to stay hidden from anyone that still might be around to make fun of her. Someone does offer them a ride home, but Jem passes since they live just around the corner not too far away. So they head off in the dark, and Jem holds the top of the costume to keep Scout steady. Scout realizes she left her shoes backstage, but when they turn around to go get them, the auditorium lights go off, leaving them in an even darker situation. Jem tells her they can get them the next day, but when Scout says that's Sunday, Jem says that the janitor can let them in. Then Jem says, "Scout?" in a question form. When Scout responds, Jem says nothing. Scout thinks that Jem wants to say something that's on his mind but just isn't ready to say so. But then Jem squeezes the top of her costume too hard and she starts to protest, but he then tells her to hush. Jem says he thought he heard something. They can barely see anything, so they start walking again, but Jem stops them again. Scout asks if Jem is trying to scare her, but he just tells her to be quiet. They hear a dog. Jem tells her he hears it when they're walking, but it stops when they stop. Scout thinks maybe it's her costume, but when they start walking, she hears what he means. Jem concludes it's Cecil and doesn't want him to get the best of them again, so they walk like they're not in a big hurry, and in order to shock Cecil first, Scout stops and turns around yelling that Cecil is a big wet hen. And Jem yells, "Hey!" They only hear echoes of the school, but no Cecil. Walking again, Jem tries to see if Scout can get her costume off and her dress on, but she doesn't think so because it's so dark. Jem tells her he's not scared and just tries to keep them walking along. He tells her they're almost to the tree, and right after that would be the road and they would see light there from the street light. The wind had stopped and they could hear whoever it was behind them with heavy steps and thick pants making swishing noises. Scout can tell with her bare feet that they are near the oak tree. When they stop, the footsteps behind them don't stop. In fact, they start running towards them. Jem tells Scout to run, but she can't keep her balance because of her costume and calls for Jem to help. Scout feels her chicken wire costume crushing around her with metal grating on metal, and then she falls to the ground and rolls away. She can hear scuffling and wrestling, the sound of shoes and body on the ground. She felt someone roll against her, and then Jem getting up and trying to help her. Scout was partly free but still tangled in the costume. They almost made it to the road when Jem gets jerked back to the ground, where she heard a crunch and a scream. Things kind of slow down for Scout at this point. They get quiet. She could hear wheezing and then someone breathing heavily and violent coughing. She calls out for Jem but can only hear the heavy breathing. Jem doesn't answer her. She can hear the man moving around looking for something, then pulling something heavy. She all of a sudden just senses that there are 4 people under the tree. She calls Atticus his name, thinking it might be him, but a man walking heavily goes by her towards the road. So Scout starts feeling the ground with her feet where the man was calling Jem's name. Her feet touch trousers and then a belt and then a face that's stubbly, so she knew it wasn't Jem, but she could smell booze. Heading toward the road, she sees a man walking under the streetlight carrying Jem, like Jem was too heavy for him, but she also notices that Jem's arm is at a crazy angle. By the time Scout gets to the corner, the man is at the house and she sees Atticus come out and help with Jem. When Scout is at the front door, Aunt Alexandra is running to meet her and she hears Scout say to call the doctor and ask where Scout is. Aunt Alexandra says Scout is there and Scout tells her that she's okay and should make the call. Aunt Alexandra calls for the doctor. Then Atticus comes out of Jem's room and calls the sheriff, telling him that someone had been after his kids, that Jem was hurt, and to go out between the school and their house and see if he's still around. Scout asks if Jem is dead. Atticus tells her no, and then asks Aunt Alexandra to look after Scout as he heads back into Jem's room. Aunt Alexandra shakily helps Scout out of her ruined costume, and she has marks where the chicken wire had been pressed against her arm. Scout asks her aunt if Jem is dead, but Aunt Alexandra just says he's unconscious and won't know more until the doctor shows up. When asked what happened, Scout tells her she doesn't know. Aunt Alexandra brings Scout her overalls to put on, and Scout notes how distracted her aunt must be if she brings her the clothes that she knows her aunt hates. The doctor pulls up. He sees Scout's okay and heads back to Jem's room. Finally, when Dr. Reynolds comes out, Scout asks him if Jem is dead. Dr. Reynolds says no and kneels down to examine her, telling her that Jem has a bump on the head and a bad break in his elbow. Remember the foreshadowing at the beginning of the book, like someone twisted it. He again has to confirm that Jem is alive to Scout. She's still asking, but that tomorrow he would need an x-ray. Dr. Reynolds finishes checking Scout over, telling her that she doesn't feel broken anywhere. And Scout asks again if he doesn't think Jem is dead and is told by the doctor that Jem has all the symptoms of being alive. As Dr. Reynolds leaves, Sheriff Hectate comes in, also confirming that Scout is okay. She tells him yes and that she's going to Jem's room, and the sheriff goes with her. Jem's room is dim and he's lying on his back with a bruise on his face and an elbow bent the wrong way. Scout tries to talk to him, but Atticus tells him that Dr. Reynolds put him out. Scout notices Aunt Alexandra in a rocking chair, and the man who brought Jem in is leaning against the wall. Scout assumes he had been at the pageant and heard their screams. Atticus is standing by Jem's bed, and the sheriff stands in the doorway. Atticus asks Hectate if he found anything, and cannot imagine anyone horrible enough to do such a thing. Hectate looks around the room and then asks Atticus to sit down. Atticus says they all should sit, and he gives Jem's desk chair while Atticus gets a chair from the living room. The man in the corner remains standing. When everyone is settled, Hectate says he found a dress which they confirm was Scout's, some weird cloth which Scout says was part of her costume. The sheriff just sits there until Atticus asks, well, what else? The sheriff then tells them that Bob Ewell is dead under the tree with a kitchen knife through his ribs. So what are we to take from this chapter? This chapter is heavy on narration and action with very little reflection. Chapter 27 had set up the situation where Scout and Jem would be alone on a dark night walking through an isolated area. Scout's mishap at the pageant ensured that they'd be going home alone as well. This chapter becomes almost like a mystery. Because of the constraints of Scout's costume, with her as our narrator, we get a limited retelling of what actually happens when they're attacked on the way home. It's dark, she's mostly covered up, and she ends up on the ground rolling around. She can't really tell who is there and what is happening. When she finally can see, someone we don't know is taking Jem home and someone is left lying on the ground. Until the end of the chapter, we don't know who it is, but the stubble and whiskey smell are a clue. When Scout gets in the house, we sense the stress of the emergency situation and the kids are assessed for injury. And we finally get to the foreshadowing from the first pages of the book, when Jem's elbow was being broken was first mentioned. We now know that he received the injury on this night. It's the arrival of the sheriff that starts to fill in some of the details when we find out that Bob Ewell is now dead, stabbed under the oak tree. We don't know how it happened or what transpired, but somehow the kids got away and Bob Ewell has been taken out. Questions? You can ask them in the comment box below.